Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Thuesen from IUPUI, where I'm Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Humanities Research in the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. I'm pleased to welcome you to this latest episode of the third season of the Center's Religion and series. The goal of the series is to create a space for thoughtful and engaged conversation at the intersection of religion and American studies. In these times, we need safe harbors to engage questions about the relationship between cultural transformation in North America and the category of religion. For the last 33 years, the Center has been doing just that through our journal, Religion and American Culture, through our Young Scholars in American Religion Fellowship program, and through our other programming, which brings scholars and practitioners together to engage religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our fields. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and thinkers to continue these critically important interventions. Every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, we discuss a topic related to religion and timely issues of our day. Today's topic is religion and Mormon studies. The field of Mormon studies has grown exponentially in recent years, resulting in an explosion of scholarship and the creation of endowed chairs at several universities. Today, we'll discuss the state of the field, considering such questions as: how has Mormon studies changed our understanding of American religion? Where does the historiography of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stand in relation to the study of other Mormonisms? Is the term Mormon here to stay? How does scholars' church affiliation or lack thereof affect their work? And finally, what are some major neglected areas in scholarship? We're also interested in your own questions, which you're invited to submit using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat function. In the latter part of today's discussion, then, we'll accommodate as many of your questions as time allows. So with that, let me turn to introducing today's distinguished panelist. Matthew Bowman is the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies and Associate Professor of History and Religion at Claremont Graduate University. A PhD graduate of Georgetown University, he's the author of, among other works, The Mormon People, The Making of an American Faith, published by Random House in 2012, The Urban Pulpit, New York City and the Fate of Liberal Evangelicalism, published by Oxford in 2014, and Christian, The Politics of a Word in America, published by Harvard in 2018. Benjamin E. Park is Associate Professor of History at Sam Houston State University and co-editor of the journal Mormon Studies Review, published by the University of Illinois Press. A PhD graduate of the University of Cambridge, he is the author of, among other works, Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, published by W. W. Norton in 2020, which was named Best Book by the Mormon History Association, and American Nationalisms, Imagining Union in the Age of Revolutions, 1783 to 1833, published by Cambridge in 2018. Jana Riess is senior columnist at Religion News Service and president of the Mormon Social Science Association. A PhD graduate of Columbia University, she is the author of numerous books, including The Next Mormons, How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church, published by Oxford in 2019, Mormonism for Dummies, co-authored with Christopher Kimball Bigelow, and Flunking Sainthood, a year of breaking the Sabbath, forgetting to pray, and Still Loving My Neighbor, published by Paraclete in 2011. And let me just say at the outset how grateful I am to all three of you for your participation today. I know it's the time of year when academics turn to pumpkins if they don't get their grades in by the midnight deadline, or I guess in Jana's case, if she doesn't get her column in. So thank you very much. And we're going to begin by tackling the questions in the session description, as I said. And the first question is about the impact of Mormon studies as a field. Back in 1985, when my emerita IUPUI colleague Jan Ships published her path-breaking book, Mormonism, The Story of a New Religious Tradition, the field was still relatively new, at least outside of Latter-day Saint circles. But since then, we've seen a veritable tsunami of scholarship. There have been chairs of Mormon studies created at several universities, as I already mentioned, not to mention new courses being offered at institutions around the country. For the past 12 years, for example, I've taught a course here at IUPUI on Mormonism and American culture. So with all these developments in mind, how has Mormon studies changed our understanding of American religion? This is kind of the big, broad state of the field question to start us out. And I'm going to call on Jana first, because I understand she has at least a couple slides of visual aids she wants to share with us. So Jana.
Hi, and thank you, Peter, for inviting us. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. So this is going to be very brief. In answer to your question, in moving from history primarily to social science and the study of Mormonism and religion more generally, one of the biggest theses in the study of Mormonism from a social science perspective has been Rodney Stark's thesis about Mormonism as being exceptional, Mormonism as having exponential growth. It turns out that that was wrong. So in answer to your question about what can Mormonism teach us about religion in general, one of the answers is that we are often wrong about religion, and that we can make pretty grave mistakes by assuming that the current situation will always be the situation. I wanted to point out, you mentioned that Mormon studies has grown exponentially, and one of the ways that that has happened in the social sciences is the launch of this brand new journal, the Journal of the Mormon Social Science Association. The inaugural issue was just published. It is an open access journal. It's available to everyone. And I wanted to look very briefly at the table of contents and highlight three things that I think are particularly interesting. It's all interesting, but three things that are particularly relevant to your questions. One is that this thesis of Mormon exceptionalism has been quite prevalent, not only among Latter-day Saints themselves, but among scholars, that Mormons are the exception to secularization, that they are exceptions to many of the trends that are happening in the religious landscape. And more recently, there are pretty serious indications that that's not so much the case. One of those articles here, The End of Growth, Fading Prospects for Latter-day Saint Expansion, takes a look at that. Global presence. This is Jason Palmer's look at La Familia versus the family, and the difference between patriarchy as it is experienced among Mormons in his wife's family versus how it is taught according to LDS doctrine, and particularly the Proclamation on the Family. And then finally, this article, The Anthropology of Mormonism. This is particularly interesting because the authors are arguing that there hasn't been an anthropology of Mormonism. Later in your questions, you're going to be asking us what are neglected areas of scholarship, and what they're saying is that there is a robust literature about the anthropology of Pentecostalism based on ethnographic research. There's a robust literature about Catholicism. And even though there has been good ethnographic research into Mormonisms around the world, it hasn't been theorized in the way these authors would want to see. So it's very interesting to look at. And I would also point out one of the things that I find interesting is that I don't know either of these people. So this article about the anthropology of Mormonism, one of the things that's happening in Mormon studies is that we've all known each other for a long time, or at least known of each other, and that's no longer the case. A lot of people are studying this because it's interesting. Wanted to point out in terms of global history and interest in having more international perspectives, the Journal of Mormon History published a special issue this year that was the first issue ever not entirely in English. As you can see, we're looking at a couple of European languages, so it's not like it's truly global, but it's the start. This year, we had the Global Mormon Studies Conference in Coventry. On the bottom right there, you see Louisa Paulson speaking. She's Danish. I would say that where global Mormon studies is right now so far is primarily still Euro-American studies. And that's something that people are becoming more aware of and something that needs to change. If you are interested in submitting a paper to next year's Global Mormon Studies Conference, which will be online in June, there are submission guidelines here, and particularly they're looking for marginalized voices in global Mormon history.
Thanks, Jana. That's a great opener there. And I mean, going back to your opening point about how one of the things that Mormon studies has taught us is that we shouldn't basically accept conventional wisdom on questions about American religions. I think that's a wonderful point and a good segue to my turning to Ben or Matt. I don't know who wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can. I want to just build on something that Jana said a moment ago, which she said was wrong, that it is the notion that Mormonism is exceptional. And that struck me as interesting because it seems to me a lot of the work that we have on Mormonism that I think does illuminate issues about American religion generally is premised on the notion that in some way Mormonism can throw into relief what we assume is normal. That is, it's kind of a juxtaposition with other things. And there's a lot of work on this in American religion, in which the normal is often presumed to be some formulation of Protestantism. I'm thinking of like Winifred Sullivan's work, Tracy Fessenden's work, that sort of thing. And one of the best books we have in Mormon studies, Kathleen Flake's book, The Politics of American Religious Identity, uses Mormonism to show how this state enforces a certain set of ideas about what religion is, which is premised on that notion of Protestantism. I mean, this is true, I think, in a lot of other areas as well, other social formations. We can see Mormonism used as a way to kind of illustrate and to throw into light the sort of things we think are normal and often are simply overlooked. I'm thinking of race as well. This is one way in which religion, I think, the study of religion can be useful. Judith Weisselfeld's work on race in African American religious movements, I think, calls into question and complicates and renders not so obvious how Americans understand race. And Paul Reeves' book on Mormonism and race does something similar. So there's a standard narrative, I think, in Mormon history, which is to say that Mormonism in the 19th century was interesting and weird and strange, and then in the 20th century it became conventional, right? And much of that's oversimplified, and I think Jenna's point is well taken, that we might ask how interesting and unique Mormonism was in the 19th century. Increasingly, it seems it may be normalizing, but generally speaking, right, that presumption and that way of looking at Mormonism as something odd or strange has, I think, illustrated a great deal about American religion.
Thanks, Matt. Ben?
Yeah, I think Jana and Matt have already hit on a number of points, but to build off of what Matt was just saying, I think it's also important that challenging the Mormons from weird to Mormons to conventional that also ties into seeing Mormons as marginal in the 19th century to mainstream in the 20th, which I think also speaks to the power of using Mormonism to understand American religion writ large. Because in the 19th century, when Mormons are seen as this marginal group, religion scholars have done a lot to show that you can understand the coherent whole of American religion by studying the margins, right? That by studying those who are on the peripheries, it puts in a better contrast what the parameters or the boundaries of American religion is at the time. And then when Mormonism goes through its slow and uneven assimilation process in the 20th century to become more of a privileged, powerful religious institution that it is today, it also shows how that works. I think we'll be talking later about what work still needs to be done. I think you could write a wonderful history on the rise of the religious right in America through the lens of Mormonism, right? How is it that this religion that used to be the type of target of this powerful religious conservatism now is able to incorporate that type of religious group? So I think showing the Mormons track from marginal to mainstream also tells us a lot about the parameters of American religion writ large. And because I love to brag about other brilliant scholarship going on, I wanted to highlight a few other things. Another few examples of how studying Mormonism has either challenged or reified broader narratives of American religious history. Recently, Adam Jortner published a book, No Place for Saints, which is a story of early Mormonism up to 1833, so early Mormonism, which really digs into how religious rhetoric transforms into religious violence, a term that's quite relevant to American discourse today, right? This relationship between discourse and free speech and eventual violence and punishment of those who fall outside the mainstream. Sally Gordon's classic work on the Mormon question, which looks at polygamy during the second half of the 19th century, digs into not just the parameters of religious freedom and this great legal history of defining what counts as free practice, but even digs into how the Mormon case of polygamy, categorized in the Reynolds v. United States decision in 1877, really defined America's understanding of religious freedom as religious belief versus religious practice, right? You can believe what you want, but practice has to be circumscribed. And Sally Gordon's book shows how Mormon is at the center of that. Matt already mentioned Kathleen Flake's book on the politics of American religious identity, so I'll skip that and share one more. Just recently, a couple months ago, hot off the press, Kay Moorman, she's not Mormon, she studies Mormons, but the name is not a writing name. Katie Moorman's wonderful book on Exceptionally Queer, which demonstrates how a white heteronormative exceptionalism shines through even in the most exceptional of religious traditions in America, showing that this exceptionalist discourse around Mormonism really helps us frame the American religious imagination more broadly.
And if I might, Mormon's book is one of the ones I was thinking of when I said we might call into question the ways in which 19th century Mormonism is exceptional. And her book, I think, does a really great job showing some of the ways in which that narrative might be overdrawn.
One thing that's certainly evident in all three of your answers is the great flowering of scholarship just in the last 20 years, really. And one can fill quite a large bookshelf with all that work. And so thank you for starting us off with such a bang. Let's move to the second question and a little bit of background. The second question follows on our first question about the influence of Mormon studies, but let's think now about the boundaries of the field itself. And for those listeners who are less familiar with Mormon studies, the Salt Lake City-based Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is just one of a number of groups tracing their lineage to the birth of Mormonism. Others include the Community of Christ, formerly the Reorganized Church based in Independence, Missouri, as well as the various smaller fundamentalist Mormon groups. So where does the historiography or the study more broadly of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stand in relation to the study of other Mormonisms? Who'd like to start us off?
I can set a stage and then let my more brilliant colleagues say smarter things, just to give a scope, because this might be new to a lot of people. When we're talking about this broad range of different Mormonisms, the numbers of that often exceeds your imagination. Signature Books just recently published a 2-volume kind of encyclopedia of the divergent paths of the Restoration, which counts over 400 different expressions of these different religious, defining expressions quite liberally here, that trace their roots back to Joseph Smith. And then even in the modern incarnations of these groups, you have ranges all the way to the modern Community of Christ, which is much more along mainline Protestant, kind of a liberalized theology. You have, of course, the famous fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which you have a subscription to any streaming service. You have access to some recent documentary or TV show in the last 12 months. You have a number of these breakoffs of those traditions. And then, of course, you have the mainstream Latter-day Saint Church. And so I think it's important to, at the one hand, note that America's very vibrant culture of schism and religious marketplace just breeds changes. And so studying the Mormon schisms is a way to study this broader parameters of schisms. Well, I would love to see studies that compare the Mormon schisms in the 19th century to the Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians that also have feature schisms in the 1840s or 1850s, or the modern day schisms in the Community of Christ tradition in the 1980s and 1990s compared to what's going on with Methodists right now. So I think noting that this is a much larger story going on, that Mormons offer one microcosm example. And second, I might be on my 5th point by now, but I think another thing to highlight is that this vibrant multiplicity of religious expressions rooted in Mormonism demonstrated that there is no one predetermined path of how Mormonism was supposed to develop, right? You can point to specific examples on specific episodes where, say, the Latter-day Saint institution based in Salt Lake City takes one route, where there are other denominations that claim the same scripture, that claim the same prophetic words, that take another route. So I think this can also push back our simplistic teleological narratives of course, it goes from Joseph Smith leading all the way to the modern day church in Salt Lake City.
Jana or Matt?
Yeah, I might build on what Ben said. I think it's a good point, and it speaks to one of the reasons why the historiography looks the way it does, and that has to do, I think, a lot with power, and the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the biggest of these churches. It is the wealthiest. Its members have historically been the ones, back from the 1940s to really the 1990s. When scholarship on the Mormon movement was being done, the vast bulk of it was being done by members of that church. And because I think many LDS authors tended to think in those theological terms that have been referenced, they tended to write the history of the LDS church as the history of Mormonism writ large, and viewed other manifestations of this movement as, to use the word Ben used a moment ago, as schism, right? As things that deviated. But Ben's point is really well taken, that is a kind of particular way of looking at it. But because we have this large bulk of often very fine work done in that period that tended to think that way, that's what later scholars have built on. I suspect, as Ben referenced, as we begin thinking about Mormonism writ large more theoretically, to think about it in terms not simply of Mormonism, but in terms of this broader question of what religion is. These questions that Ben raises about separation, right, about division, and about differing manifestations being shaped by different cultural forces, will rise to the fore, and these other variants of Mormonism, these other participants in the Mormon tradition, will get increasingly the sort of attention that they deserve, and the questions that they raise, I think, will become more salient.
I have very little to add to those excellent answers, except just to say that many of these, the flowering of this tradition, Ben has referenced, many of these traditions are profoundly underrepresented in Mormon studies, and that is one of the things that needs to be addressed. I was on a panel at AAR SBL recently responding to Under the Banner of Heaven, and Christina Rossetti, one of the other panelists, basically noted that all of the LDS people who had responded to Under the Banner of Heaven had not even made an effort at all to understand it from the fundamentalist point of view. And that was, I thought, a very powerful argument. I think she's right.
Well, and Christina's book is coming out next year, I believe, with U of Illinois. Is that correct?
Yes, it's part of the series Introduction to Mormon Thought that I'm helping to edit. It's due in the last quarter of next year. And for those who don't know, her book, it will be called Joseph Musser, a Mormon Prophet, and it is an intellectual history of one of the leading fundamentalist thinkers and theologians.
Right. So that study is really going to, I think, increase our resources tremendously just by itself for studying Mormonism outside of the LDS Church. Well, when I say LDS Church, that leads into the next question, which is about naming, and that's a bit of a contentious issue for anyone who has followed news from the church the last few years. And a little bit of backstory on that. When Russell Nelson became president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2018, one of his first official acts was to issue new guidelines stating that the terms Mormon and Mormonism should be avoided in favor of the church's official name. Now, in one sense, that advice was in keeping with the advice of a number of decades, but it seemed more insistent in its articulation. Of course, in terms of scholarship on Mormonism, it's complicated because there's more to Mormonism, as we've just been discussing, than the LDS Church. So scholars have continued to use the terms Mormon and Mormonism. The Mormon History Association, for example, hasn't changed its name. And it wasn't that long ago that the church itself actually encouraged the use of the name Mormon through its I'm a Mormon PR campaign begun in 2010. So what's the future of terminology? What's the future of the term Mormon or Mormonism? Who wants to touch that one?
I can take a stab at it because, in my context of writing a column for Religion News Service, this comes up all the time. Journalists were singled out, I would say, in President Nelson's initial introduction of the name change, saying that respectful members of the media would abide by this. And I think that members of the media want to be respectful and want to honor what a church or religion wants to call itself. However, language does not stop on a dime, does not change overnight, and journalists' job is to inform their readers, and the term that readers know is the term Mormon. So, it's been 3.5, nearly 4 years since President Nelson took office is not quite the right term, but became president of the church. This has been a major push of his tenure. And I don't expect that it's going to go away anytime soon, but I also don't expect that it's really going to have a deep impact in the broader culture. I think that, in the United States, Mormons are probably 1.3% of the population around the world, about 0.1%. And they're lucky if anyone notices them at all, frankly. So insisting that language change overnight is just not realistic.
If I might, I'm of two minds about this. The first is, I think it raises some interesting problems for scholars of religion, which is to say, this is something Russell McCutcheon has written about. To what extent do you adopt insider language, insider norms, insider discourse versus looking at religion from the outside? And certainly I think it's fair to interrogate the reasons and the rationale for this, and to look at the impact it's having within the church. And of course, for reasons that Jana mentioned, I hold a chair of Mormon Studies, which has not become a chair of Latter-day Saint Studies or anything like that. In part because, and this is where I'm of two minds, in part because I have students who are studying other variants of Mormonism other than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we want to be inclusive in that sense. So in that way, I actually found Nelson's request and the impact that it's had in the academy rather useful, because it prevents us from using the word Mormon as shorthand for the LDS Church, which is valuable as we're trying to think of Mormonism as something with multiple manifestations and multiple variants. I've begun speaking of the Mormon tradition more broadly as all those churches, that trace their legacy back to Joseph Smith, and the LDS Church, as Latter-day Saints, to designate the Salt Lake City Church. And in that way, I think that sort of precision has been useful, even though, as I say, the reasons for it and the motivations behind it are something I think that scholars may be interested in studying rather than simply following blindly.
Yeah, I think that was all well said. A few things to add. One is, when we're writing about the past, it also gets tricky because we want to use the terms that would have been relevant or accurate for discussing the period we're discussing, right? So, I mean, if we're discussing the I'm a Mormon moment in 2012, where the church pours in millions of dollars into advertising a certain image, it would be historically inaccurate and wrong not to invoke those languages to explain what was going on there. Second, connected to Matt's point about what I call the broader Mormon diaspora, right? All these different denominations that traces back to Joseph Smith. It's important to remember that the history that we're writing about isn't just claimed by the Latter-day Saint tradition, right? I mean, it's not just this Latter-day Saints based in Salt Lake City who claim what went on in Nauvoo. And so it would be unfair to describe what's going on just based on the lexicon dictated out of Salt Lake City. And third, I think there's theological baggage associated with a number of terms or names that the church has encouraged journalists and scholars to use. Terms like the restored gospel of Jesus Christ or the Church of Jesus Christ, which were the shorthands they suggested to use instead of, say, Mormonism. There's a lot of meaning packed into those words that that the authors and the readers don't necessarily buy into. As the wonderful historian Artis Parshall once wrote, there's no Mormon doctrine of Jello, but there is a Mormon culture of Jello, right? And the Mormon, rather than Latter-day Saints or Church of Christ, captures that culture versus doctrine or revelation distinction. And so, like, for me, the compromise I find when I write is that when I'm referring to the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, based in Salt Lake City and presided over by Russell Nelson, especially post the 2017 or 2018 suggestion, I use a full name referring to the institution. I think institutions have a right to say what they're called, with these other caveats that we've called on. And I want to say one final point, that when Mormon Studies is already partly seen with a suspicious eye by many academic participants or my colleagues who are not sure if Mormon Studies is a rigorous or detached discipline, if we were to all change our language that we use to refer to the church based on a dictate coming out of Salt Lake City from the church president, I think that would confirm a lot of those fears that academics have. So I think there's also the relevancy and the potency of the Mormon Studies as a field involved when we're talking about these questions.
Thanks. You all have gotten at a number of facets of that issue, and I think that these are very helpful answers. The next question is about not the church's identity, but scholars' own identity. Many prominent scholars of Mormonism are, of course, themselves Latter-day Saints. And I would note that this is especially true of the holders of named chairs of Mormon Studies. I'm thinking of you, Matt, and also Kathleen Flake at UVA, Patrick Mason at Utah State Paul Reeve at U of Utah. On the other hand, of course, there are also many well-known non-Mormon scholars of Mormonism. Laurie Maffley Kipp, John Turner are two people who come to mind. So how does the churches, or I'm sorry, how do scholars' church affiliation or lack thereof affect their work?
I can start, I suppose. Yeah, this is a valuable question, and it's one I think, of course, it's grappled with across study of religion generally, right? And it's, again, this sort of question of insider versus outsider. I think historically, at least, I mentioned earlier how it was because of the institutional and the financial and the simple, human power of the LDS Church that prompted what we call the new Mormon history in the middle 20th century. That is, this sort of flourishing of scholarship that was done, at least attempted to be done according to the demands of various academic disciplines. There have been a lot of arguments that we're past the new Mormon history now, and I think to some extent that's true because more and more non-LDS people or people not affiliated with any Mormon church are working on this tradition. But we may be moving past it in an ideological sense as well. I think one of the real questions about people involved with the tradition in some way, writing about it, and one of the ways we might look for the influence of their affiliation is it's not necessarily whether or not they are biased, quote unquote. Everybody's biased, right, in one way or another. Rather, I think that work that is affected by people's affiliation with the Mormon tradition, whether active participation or actually exit from the tradition, tends to be very interested in the status of the church. Or any of the Mormon churches. People who write about Mormonism because they care about Mormonism tend to ask the sorts of questions that reflect that care in one way. And an example of that might be, I think, as I've been thinking about this, is Fawn Brody's biography of Joseph Smith. Right, Fawn Brody exited the church, but many of the questions she asked about Joseph Smith were really rotated around whether or not Joseph Smith was sincere or not. What was going on in Joseph Smith's head? And in a way, right, that book has been incredibly influential and incredibly important because it framed how many scholars since have looked at Joseph Smith. They've been kind of obsessed with his sincerity. But his sincerity, the sincerity of this one man, as Laurie Maffley Kipp has written about this, that's hardly gets at the number of fascinating questions that might be asked about 19th century Mormonism. Right, and I think scholars that are interested in things beyond Joseph Smith's sincerity would ask other questions about him, about his impact, about his life, and about the sorts of things that he did. It's kind of missing the forest for the trees in that sense.
Yeah, and I'd add to what you just said, Matt, that Laurie Maffley Kipp's article on the sincere believer is a great place for people to turn if they're interested in what Matt was just talking about. Ben or Jana, did you want to address that question? And fair, if you wish to pass too, we can discuss other things.
I'll be quick, and then I'm sure Jana will have something brilliant that will subsume whatever I say. In an ideal world, I don't think the standing of a scholar would matter much, but we're not in an ideal world. But also, I think it's fair that we also operate in an academy where positionality and biases are dissected. I mean, scholars are meant to explain where our questions are coming from, as Matt so eloquently dictated. I think there's both a positive and a downside of the fact that these questions permeate Mormon studies discourse. And I think permeate is a correct term. If you follow this world much at all, the person's affiliation with the church or belief or non-belief is often an issue. I think there's a good thing and a bad thing that comes out. The good thing is it connects the study. It connects Mormon studies to this Mormon world. People care about this scholarship. These books sell. People attend these conferences. Not only do people attend the Mormon History Association, but they attend sessions at the conference, right? The seats are actually filled. You don't get that in a lot of disciplines, which I think is quite crucial. It's filled with people who come from non-academic backgrounds who are just interested in the field. So I think it's fair for us to recognize that if we are going to reach this broader public and engage in this community, that we can't always dictate what the priorities of that community are, and we have to figure out what they are and react accordingly. So I think that's the bright side. I think the downside is that there really is, going back to the point of power that Matt has brought up a few times, the LDS Church, LDS donors, those who affiliate with the church and expect a certain type of orthodox priority, I think they're going to be playing an increasing role in the field as funding for the humanities, as funding for academic work continues to not go very well, shall we say. The role of fundraising and the role of donors who often come outside of the academic world and have their own priorities and want to have their money spent in certain ways that match their interests, I think that's going to continue to conflict. So I think this problem, far from going away, it's only going to become more more acute going forward.
Jana?
Well, Ben has beautifully encapsulated what I was about to say about the future of the humanities and sort of where we're going with funding and donations. So I'm going to pass on this. And Ben, I'm sorry to disappoint you in my lack of brilliance here, but you already covered it so well.
We have one more pre-announced question, and I'm going to ask that, but I want to note at the same time that we've had several questions submitted in the Q&A, and so if we could, if you could react briefly to the last pre-announced question, and then we'll move straight to some of the questions that have been submitted. So the last announced question is, what are some major neglected areas in scholarship? And I think that some of your previous answers have touched on some of those areas, but you may wish to highlight some other wish list sorts of topics for scholarship.
I do have a quick answer here. I mentioned global Mormon studies and the need for expansion, the need for understanding how different Mormonisms have interacted with different cultures. I would also say I'm very interested in studies about education. And if, I'm going to undermine what I said before about the LDS Church not being exceptional. But on the other hand, I think in terms of education and programs and indoctrination, it has proven somewhat exceptional, and there hasn't really been any good comprehensive study about that. I am interested in big data, and that's only recently become available. Brian Burge says we are now living in a golden age of data of American religion, and Mormonism is really tough to capture. And certainly the LDS Church is hard to capture, but anything even smaller than that is nearly impossible to capture. So that will be interesting. The arts, the founding of the Center for Latter-day Saint Arts, and all of the work that has been doing to bring art, music into the public imagination. And finally, organizational behavior. There hasn't really been a good understanding from the perspective of someone who has been very well versed in organizational behavior studies to understand some of the decisions that the LDS Church, which is primarily what I study, has made in the world. And I would sign up to read that book.
Building on what Jana says, my normal answer to this is globalization, right? Questions of religion and globalization. We're seeing, I think, the beginnings of that, and there's a lot of interesting work there. My other answer would be, I think, work that looks at the Mormon tradition through the lenses of various, I think, theoretical questions that have taken root in religious studies over the last couple of decades. I mean, I'm going back to the 90s here, really, but there's not really any good work on Mormonism and lived religion, for instance. There is increasingly, I think, as we're seeing a kind of business turn in American religious history, we need more work on Mormonism and business. There's been a couple of books to that end. David Walker's and Allison Kelly's forthcoming work as well. But that speaks, I think, to this deeper question of what happened to the church as the LDS church I'm talking about here, as it modernizes. Right? And what happened as it becomes a modern religion? And there's been actually, I think David Howlett is doing some really, really excellent work on these questions for Community of Christ, in questions of globalization, but also questions of organization, questions of modernization. And in fact, in a kind of, I think, fun turnaround, there's been much, I think, very little work up to the caliber of what he is writing on the LDS church to date. So yeah, that sort of thing.
And building on David, I'm glad you invoked David Howlett's work because it's quite crucial. And he also points to another avenue, which is these divergent Mormon expressions. His wonderful book on the Kirtland Temple as a point of religious pilgrimage for Mormon Community of Christ, reorganized or restorationist groups, I think is a great model. Just recently, we had Caroline Klein's wonderful book, Mormon Women at the Crossroads, which is both global and focused on gender and modern, all these terms that we're needing more of in the Mormon field. Speaking of global Mormonism, I think Lori Maffley Kipp is here. Her forthcoming History of Global Mormonism is going to be the book we've long waited for. And I think it wouldn't be a call for more scholarship in Mormon studies if someone didn't say we need more on the 20th century, so I'll do that. The 20th century is fascinating. I just finished a project that did bring me into the 20th century, and you guys, there's lots of great stuff there that sometimes we miss when we focus on Joseph Smith and Brigham Young in the 19th century. So I think all of those are great avenues that I'm excited to see more in.
I might just follow up on that one more thing to what Ben said about Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. I think that's been a stumbling block for a lot of history, especially the LDS Church. It's very interested in institutions and in power and in leadership like that. Jana has pointed, I think, to how difficult it can be to do the sort of grassroots, bottom-up sort of study of this. But that, I think, more than anything else, is what the LDS Church is crying out for.
Okay, we have several submitted questions, and the first one is on a really big issue, but I'm going to have to restrict you to a really brief response. And so the big issue is, what can you say to articulate Mormonism's relationship to Christianity writ large? I mean, this is the question that so often comes up when I teach Mormonism and American culture. Students, most of whom here are non-Latter-day Saints, want to know, well, what is Mormonism's relationship to Christianity? And so new thoughts on that old question?
My question to that is, what is Christianity?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, and Jan Ship's response is, what's it to you? Why are you asking? And so, I mean, there are various ways of turning the question back, but it continues to be a perennially interesting issue, I think, to a lot of people who read about the broad Mormon tradition.
Yeah, it's usually that's a theological question, right? It's a question about belief, about doctrine, about ideas, and that sort of thing. And that's the way in which the questions I will often engage with, right? It's like, what do these people believe, and what do those people believe? And to my earlier point about what is Christianity, right? And that kind of presumes a sort of Reformed Protestant intellectual definition of what Christianity is. But that makes sense in the United States because of the influence of that version of Protestantism in the United States. So we start thinking of it in those terms and in those ideas. I think, the point that's made polemically often is that Mormonism is a Christian heresy or a variant of Christianity or something like that. But if we think of Christianity writ large as a kind of term of legitimation, that is, if you're Christian, you have certain you're part of the majority, you have certain power, you have certain rights and privileges in the United States. Then the question of Mormonism's relationship to Christianity becomes, I think, interesting and about exclusion and inclusion as much as just definitions. And looking at it, I think, in that way raises a lot of interesting points.
It's almost like you can write a book on the politics of the word Christian, right, Matt? Further along those lines, I strongly recommend the book by John Turner on a biography of the Mormon Jesus, which does a great job at kind of clawing back the definition of Christ to show that if we're only when we're defining Christianity in this very narrow, modern, evangelical definition does Mormonism not fit, but that Mormonism's Christism fits in this much historically broader tradition of what Christianity means. So just one book plug.
Jana, unless you had something to add, I'm going to move to the second question, which is submitted by Charlie McCrary, but on behalf of Dana Logan, who had to leave. And so Dana's question is there, if there was no such thing as Mormon studies and scholars had to swim in the American religious history pool, how would work on Mormonism be different? It's an interesting question to ponder.
I'm going to jump in here just to say that
yes.
Question, my degree is in American religious history. I do swim in that pool. I don't quite understand these as mutually exclusive categories. Dana's not here to clarify that, but does anyone else have, am I missing something, I guess, is my question.
I think to me, what the question seems to be getting at is if we were writing books only for the American religious history, not having the Mormon studies community as a background as our primary audience, how would we be writing things differently? And I think for one hand, there's a lot of benefit that comes from writing for a community who's deeply invested and deeply knowledgeable of this otherwise parochial topic, right? I think another way of answering this question is the books that are written by people who aren't necessarily experts in Mormon studies, but incorporate Mormonism into their work, which is great. I want to see most of that. A lot of times my reactions to those are, there's actually this wealth of historiographical and methodological discussion on these topics going on that sometimes gets overlooked. And so I think there's merit in these insider discourse sometimes going on, but that merit ends when we're not willing to translate it outside that field. So, right. So Mormon studies to me is only interesting so far as it can prove its relevancy to these broader disciplines, whether it be American religious history or global religious history or so forth.
And it's interesting that all three of you have published books not only on Mormonism, but on other topics. So I think you're all three examples of scholars who think about the broader issues of the field. Matt, where you look like I cut you off.
Yeah. No, I think Ben mostly covered it, right? I think it would look two things. It would look, I think, much more methodologically theoretical, and it would look more comparative.
Now that you've explained this to me and I understand the question better, and I'm sorry I misunderstood at the beginning, I'm thinking back to the article that I recommended about anthropology that was in this inaugural issue of the Journal of Mormon Social Science Association, because this is their argument essentially for anthropology, that some of this work has been done for a while, but no one is talking to each other, and that it's not necessarily conversant with the literature on the anthropology of religion in the way it needs to be. I think in Mormon studies, there has been so much emphasis on history until very, very recently. Even branching out into any other disciplines seems like a big deal. And so that is, I think that the challenge for Mormon scholars is going to be to become experts in those disciplines and to really be conversant with that literature and not just rely on the inside baseball knowledge that we have relied on for a long time.
Colby Townsend has a literary question for us. While the Book of Mormon is foundational Mormon scripture, it is increasingly viewed as important early American literature. What is the future of the study of the Book of Mormon alongside the writings of Walter Scott and James Fenimore Cooper and some of the Doctrine and Covenants alongside of things like Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass?
I can take a quick stab at this. I think that's one of the most exciting developments in the field of Mormon studies recently. And I think the volume that was put together by Elizabeth Hinton and Jared Hickman on the Book of Mormon as American literature that approached it in the context of race and gender, not so much class, but should see more in class and in literature during that period, I think it's quite fascinating. That's been a hard pull, though, because given the politics of Mormon studies that we've been discussing several times already in this hour, it's one thing to critique living humans that existed, from Wilford Woodruff to Amy Brown Lyman. It's another thing to dissect scripture. And that I think that's going to bring added politics in the Mormon studies realm. But I would say the more the merrier on these types of dissection. I think that's going to improve the maturity of the field.
I would add, in addition to the works of literature that Colby lists, right, also the Code of Hampton Lake, Message to a Black Man in America, the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, right? There's a lot of what we might call American scripture. And indeed, I think because of Americans' kind of Protestant heritage, the sort of notion of scripture as a foundational piece of what it means to be religious is interesting to study. And studying the Book of Mormon comparatively with these other works, I think, is really valuable.
I'm going to jump in and just add a comment, follow up to the Christianity question a few minutes ago, which was asked by Paul Croce, and he adds that for brevity, a starting point would be a starting point for considering Mormonism would be a monotheism in the Judaic tradition with the addition of the centrality of Jesus. I'm going to draw us to a close with a final question asked by an anonymous attendee, and I think it's a great question to end on. What would be one piece of advice you can pinpoint for students or emerging scholars in the field?
I'm going to be a bit selfish here, but get your institution to subscribe to Mormon Studies Review, the journal that I co-edit with the much more brilliant Quincy Newell, because we've tried over the last few years to not just review the field, and I really think the best way to catch up in the field is these brilliant reviews written by people both within and outside the field on these topics. But we've tried to gather with every issue these forums on topics, whether it be gender or race or class or money, that kind of get us take stock on where the field stands on those issues. And those often point to what work needs to be done further. And so I strongly recommend that despite me being involved, that journal is a great starting point to dig where the future of the field can be.
I'd second that. And I would also urge your institution to subscribe to Religion and American Culture, because we carry a good many articles on the study of Mormonism as well. So yes, thanks, Ben. Jana or Matt?
Yeah, I would actually say study non-Mormon religions. Study things that aren't LDS. And I'm going to actually rectify an error I made earlier here. When I evoked David Howland, I did not invoke Melissa Inouye's work. And I think she is doing the closest work to what Howland is doing about the growth and spread of the Global Latter-day Saint Church around. And I'm citing her because her book, her initial work was on religion that was not LDS, but I think that book about the True Jesus Church in China has allowed her, I think, to understand and comprehend how Mormonism spreads globally in really fascinating and interesting ways.
I second that. I think that my advice is going to sound contradictory. On the one hand, I think you should not do your dissertation on Mormonism unless you've already started, and good, more power to you. But in terms of not only broadening your career possibilities, it's a good strategic decision, but also in terms of contributing to Mormon studies, you will have even more to contribute as an expert in something else. And that's going to help you find your niche. But then at some point, go deep in whatever aspect of Mormon studies you find particularly fascinating, and don't look back. You will be welcomed in whatever capacity and whatever you're wanting to study.
Great advice from three seasoned professionals, and I want to thank all three of you for this wonderful webinar. This has been really stimulating, and I want to thank the audience for joining us, and remind you that after each of these, we provide a link in the chat for completing a short survey. So you can either click on it now or look in your email. We'll send it to you there also. So please share your thoughts on this session and ideas for the future. And stay tuned for our next episode in the series on January 19th. Finally, the recording of this webinar will be available on the center's YouTube channel next week. That's RAAC Tube. So with that, a final thank you to our three distinguished panelists, and happy holidays to all. And we will see you in January.